Hello. I first decided to undertake my topic after a conversation that Professor Ng and I had, in which I asked her, what was the best use of time for an environmental organization? Was it policy making and lobbying, or was it creating public awareness? For varying reasons, we both came to agree that public awareness was the best use of time, and that the best way to find public awareness was through a science-based marketing campaign. Now, any marketing course will tell you that the key to selling your product is through human psychology. Now, as I started to think about climate change and psychology, I started to work my way backwards and ask the question, well, what is the psychology of climate change? And that's how I landed upon my topic. I started off by asking that exact question. What is the psychology of climate change? Why is it that even though we know the terrible impacts of our own actions, do we decide to justify those impacts? And it was those types of questions that led me to look through the literature and find an interest in the topic. What I was hoping for when I initially started was one simple, all-encompassing, just one sentence that would answer all of my questions as to the psychology. However, what I found was that, like climate change itself, the psychology of it is both complex, multi-layered, and multifaceted. I started my research off with a study done on the Australian population back in 2016. The researchers used a fancy psychological surveying method in order to weed out the population's true sentiments towards climate change, as well as to figure out the meaning behind those sentiments. Now, I won't bore you with the mechanics of the surveying techniques, because personally I don't understand them myself, but the article was published in a peer-reviewed journal, so it can be assumed that the techniques were sound. What I will tell you is the notable findings of that survey. The researchers found that even though there was high concern about climate change within the general population, pro-environmental behavior tended to be pretty low. They also found that if a person had more time, i.e. worked a part-time job, then they tended to do pretty mild pro-environmental actions like i.e. recycling, carpooling, composting. But if a person had less time, more stressful job, whatever, lots of kids, then they tended to do all of these actions less. But, almost paradoxically, if a person had more time, they tended to consume more. So more clothing, more restaurants, that kind of stuff. What they also found was that if a community engaged in more pro-environmental action and there was more support, then the risk perception of climate change actually tended to be lower. The article, in essence, came to few conclusions about the data, but they did attempt to establish a knowledge base in order to create better policy decisions on the matter. The next form of literature that I researched was in a scholarly book written in 2018 by the leading academics on the subject, and it went by the creative title of Psychology and Climate Change. The book appeared to cover every conceivable aspect relating to psychology and climate change. So I selected a few subsections of chapters that I deemed most relevant to my topic of study. The first major topic of interest for me was barriers to conversations. So why is it that we cannot talk about climate change? What is it in our own heads that prevents us from doing so? The authors noted that from their research, they found that students often don't discuss climate change for fear of their own incompetencies on the subject, noting that if students feel this way, it is likely that the general population will follow suit. And they gave two major reasons for this. One is that the education system has failed in delivering the actual mechanics of how climate change works, leaving the population sort of ignorant to the real ground stuff. And the next is that climate change is such a big issue. It's multi-layered, complex, but most of all, abstract. There are so many causes to climate change, whether it's CO2 in the atmosphere or whatnot, and there are so many negative outcomes, whether it's the extinction of species, the warming of the oceans, you name it. So that culminates in a massive brain block due to complexities. The next chapter I looked at was psychological barriers. So this chapter included a comprehensive list of each psychological barrier that works towards holding back humanity. The list has about 100 separate traits, so to make it a little more palatable, they divided it into 7 subcategories. Now I'll just give a brief explanation of each subcategory for you. So the first one is limited cognition. Essentially, our brains evolved 100,000 years ago. So back then, we didn't have such complex, multi-layered issues that we had to deal with and work through. Our issues were pretty straightforward and single causal. The next category is our ideologies. So essentially, when it comes to psychology, if we have a certain ideology, we will be sequestered into a distinct line of thinking, and often we are not able to go outside of that line of thought. The next one, as they've titled it, is called significant others, which is essentially how our social norms play into our behavior and how often it's difficult to break free from those social norms. The next one is sunk costs, which can be explained with this example. Like, let's say you just bought or just saved up and bought a new air conditioner, and then here comes a new policy, new law saying that you have to get rid of this air conditioner. You're not really going to want to do that or vote for the politician because you've worked hard, whatever. Anyway, the next category is called disredence, and it's essentially that we mistrust a lot of people, a lot of things. So, for instance, if a government is putting in a climate policy, you might be questioning what is the thinking behind that? Are they being lobbied? Even if the policy is in good faith, we often tend to just be mistrustful. The next category is our perceived risk. So, like I previously stated, we're pretty ignorant on most of the science behind climate change. So our perceived risk of the issue tends to be a lot lower than it actually should be. And then the final category is limited behavior, which is essentially that we're kind of lazy as a species and that we want to do the minimal amount of action towards climate change, to solve climate change. The next source I looked into was media outlets, and to see whether or not there were any mentions of the psychology of climate change. I looked at The Economist, which is a peer-reviewed magazine, and it tends to have a educated, higher class audience. And there were a few articles on the subject, so that just proved that the issue was out there. But there were no prolific conclusions come upon by the authors of the articles. Thank you for listening to my brief introduction to the psychology of climate change. Cheers.